Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our special coverage of the Russia-Ukraine fire. With me, I'm Abdulrahim Kashour, coming to you live on the L24 News from Algiers. Ukraine and the West could decide to send a clear signals to Putin that withdrawal from Ukraine as part of negotiated agreements is less costly to him than a further escalation of the military operation. This strategy would require the Ukrainian people to be willing to make more enormous sacrifices on the battlefield to raise the cost of this invasion. More in this will be discussed with our panel of guests via Skype. We have Tom O'Connor, senior foreign policy writer at Newsweek Staten Island from New York, and Ruslan, director of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics from Kiev. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen, and the discussion begins right after this break. Starting our special show with the latest updates over the situation in Ukraine. Talks between Russian and Ukrainian officials are expected to resume today, Tuesday. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has sought to extend in his country for an additional 30 days from March 24th. Ukraine's Minister of Defense has claimed 150 Russian troops were killed after trying to take control of the southern part of the city. Prime Ministers of Czech Republic, Poland and Slovenia traveled to Kiev today, Tuesday, to meet Zelensky as representative of the European Union leaders. Refugee exodus reached 2.8 million as Russia strikes hit West Ukraine. Two powerful explosions rocked the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. Before dawn, and emergency services said 2 people died when an apartment building in Kiev was shelled. The mayor of Kiev announced a 35-hour-long curfew in the Ukrainian capital.
It was once a calm place where 100 lived. Now it's all gone. This 9-story high building in the capital, Kiev, was shelled last night just before dawn. 2 people died and 35 were rescued. Here, tears speak louder than words.
We really were not expecting this. We thought that a small building in the outskirts of Kiev, nothing bad could happen to it. We went to sleep as usual. Around 5 o'clock, but bam, I could not understand where I was. We were in our pajamas.
Not far from this residential area, another missile fell close to the center of the Ukrainian capital, leaving 1 person killed and vehicles damaged.
1 man, 58 years old, killed. 4 or 5 people are injured. There was a missile attack here. Today it's the 3rd attack in Kiev.
The mayor of Kiev came to check the damages. He fears that more is yet to come.
We saw what is happening in Kharkiv, we saw what is happening in Mariupol, and now we're facing the same situation in our city.
Today, a 35-hour-long curfew was announced in the Ukrainian capital. No one is allowed moving inside the city without a special pass, unless they are asked to go into a bomb shelter.
And starting with you, Mr. O'Connor, good morning over there. UK thinks Putin's troops can only fight for 2 more weeks. So, do you really think that Ukraine army can stand for another 2 weeks, taking into consideration that Russia didn't use all what it has?
Sure. Well, it's a great question. I think right now we've heard senior U.S. officials say that Russia has committed 100% of its readiness force into the operation. Of course, we don't have independent verification of that at the moment. We do know that Russia has been pouring in more of its resources into the conflict as of recently. We know that it's not been expended yet, of course. I think that it does seem that Russia would be able to sustain an operations of this nature for another 2 weeks, certainly. It depends, though, if Russia chooses to escalate, which is something that we've seen more in past days and past weeks as well of this conflict, is that Russia willing to use a greater force, still not leveraging the full extent of Russia's military might, of course. We're talking about a contingent of Russia's forces that have been pre-planned for this operation. There's always the possibility, given the proximity of this conflict to Russia's own borders and that of Belarus, its ally, that Russia could invest more into this conflict, of course, at a greater cost.
So just a direct question, Okana. Why puts Russia just to hold its military operation directly? Why they are not investing everything they have?
Well, I think that part of this is that Russia had wanted to mitigate the sort of costs ahead of time that this would inflict upon Russia's own military. And most major countries, when they wage any sort of operation, whether it was the U.S. and other conflicts, would not put in the full extent of their military involved. They sort of want to ration out a part of it. It does seem that Russia has faced quite severe resistance from Ukrainian forces, perhaps more than anticipated, especially in the early stages of this. But now we're seeing Russia really gearing up some of these operations, getting into major cities, and this is where fears were that casualties could really skyrocket at some point when this battle takes a more urban nature, when Russia is using more intensive firepower, and Ukrainian forces are forced to regroup in the cities themselves.
Mr. Ruslan, how about you as a Ukrainian national? Do you still believe that Kiev can survive this military operation? If so, based on what?
Going to capture the Kiev at all. Russia is going to surround the Kiev and to make the very heavy social, economical, humanitarian situation inside the city, where are more than 2 million people still. In such way, Russia will try to push to the Zelensky, president of Ukraine, to the capitulation. As I know, as we research it, Russia were not going in the first etap of war to capture the big city at all. So the Russian militaries go through many cities like Sumy or Chernihiv and go to the Kiev because they were trying just to cut Ukrainian territory and to make a situation for capitulation of Zelensky. Nowadays we see the transformation of this war from the special operation for pushing to capitulation to the total war. When the Russia is demonstrates the readiness to capture the cities like Mariupol, Kherson at all, when we see the Russia controls more than 20% of Ukrainian territory, which are inhabited more than 2 million people, when Russia is going to stand the occupation regimes with Ukrainian collaboratorists in this territory.
Coming back to you, Mr. O'Connor, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said that the talks between Ukraine and Russia's delegation will continue today as well. So far, Mr. O'Connor, the negotiations have not produced any results. Do you think that the next round will at least make progress and compromise on the Ukrainian side?
Well, after I believe it was the third round or so, we did hear both sides separately from each other say that there seemed to be some sort of progress made. We know Russia's demands, which is a cessation of hostilities, a recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, recognition of Russia's control of Crimea, and also, of course, neutrality embedded in Ukraine's constitution rather than a bid to join NATO. We've heard President Zelensky say that some of these things would be on the table to be discussed. We haven't heard him yet say that he would agree to them, of course, but especially when it seems to be the neutrality issue, which I think is core to Russia's concerns and going into this conflict and part of the roots of this crisis, it does seem that this is something that the Ukrainians are at least willing to discuss of course, probably with some sort of security assurances, not only from Russia, but also from Western countries, that any sort of future incursion would be met perhaps with a greater response or some sort of premeditated response from the West. So I do think that, yet there's still hope right now that there could be a negotiated outcome to this conflict. I think no matter what happens on the battlefield, there will have to be some sort of talks to predicate the end of the conflict.
Taking into consideration that if the talks happen again, and do you think that Ukraine will go on the weakness side right now? They don't have the power they already have before this military operation has been launched.
Yeah, I think that certainly there will be a sort of, well, if you think about the beginning of this, honestly, one of the things that President Putin had said he wants to do was demilitarize Ukraine. And no matter what the actual outcomes of the conflict is, I think that the Russians will be able to walk away and say they did that. And we can speculate as to the degree to which that is true or not. But I think that with the backing of NATO and the United States, billions of dollars coming in, especially after this conflict, depending on, of course, the nature of the end of this conflict, I think Ukraine will be able to refit its military. Obviously, I think there was a lot of underestimation as to the ability of Ukraine's forces after at least 8 years or so of backing from the West to begin with.
Okay, understood. Mr. Ruslan, in Ukraine, after all these casualties and destruction, is there any chance left for diplomatic talks? In other words, what experts and even people are waiting and anticipating from diplomacy that started months ago, but at the end they failed? What will change now?
We are waiting, of course, we are waiting the peace. And as I know, the negotiation between Russia and Ukraine are not useless because both sides yesterday and just today are talking about the new agreement between Russia and Ukraine on the regulation agreement, which is very concrete. And the sides for nowadays are talking with the concrete articles, concrete paragraphs in this agreement. In general idea of this agreement, there is, it looks like there is a possible consensus between Ukraine and Russia. This consensus should consist from the NATO status, should consist of demilitarization, and should consist, of course, of evacuation of Russian troops from Ukrainian territories. Talking about the Donetsk and Lugansk region and Crimea, as I heard, these questions are put out of this from this negotiation and postponed for the future.
Ruslan, I'm sorry to cut your train of thought.
I'm
sorry to cut your train of thought, but it is said that the president, Vladimir Zelensky, is the one responsible for the failing of all these diplomatic talks because he was stubborn. He never wanted to do anything and to give any compromise to Russia. What are you saying about this?
I think this is just a position, a high position in negotiation, not more. But every day, without any exclusion, Ukrainian and Russian delegation continue their negotiation. And as I know, yesterday, Ministry of Justice of Ukraine took participation in this negotiation, and this negotiation was extremely concrete, and maybe we are close to some draft of the agreement which we should see in the nearest weeks.
According to White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki, Washington warned Russia of significant consequences if it provides military or other assistance to Russia during a high-level meeting in Rome.
Security advisor in this meeting is that should they provide military or other assistance that of course violates sanctions or supports the war effort, that there will be significant consequences. But in terms of what those specifics look like, we would coordinate with our partners and allies to make that determination. If China were to decide to be an economic provider or to take additional steps there to Russia, they only make up 15% or 15 to 20% of the world's economy. The G7 countries make up more than 50%. So there are a range of tools at our disposal in coordination with our European partners, should we need to use them. But again,
Mr. O'Connor, what that's supposed to mean? Washington wars China. Seriously, are they looking for a solution or just to create another problem with one of the biggest armies in the world and also one of the strongest economic leaders? While you need to be smart and make China an ally, you do the opposite. It makes no sense. What can you say about that?
Well, I think the U.S. in this regard is in a very difficult position because of the fact that over the past few years, especially under the Trump administration, a little bit before that, and especially now as well under the Biden administration, there has been a concerted effort to make China out to be the top adversary for U.S. foreign policy, and to now turn to China and ask for its essentially for its support and ask for it to not support its comprehensive strategic partner is a very difficult position. I think that China is seeking to remain somewhat neutral on this. I think that they don't see supplying limited amounts of aid to Russia, perhaps not overt large military systems, but just economic assistance as just natural for two countries to do, whether or not they support a conflict or not. I don't think China feels like it would have to be cut off from Ukraine either in this conflict, which also is a strategic partner. So I think, yes, I think the U.S. is asking a lot from China, and I think we'd have to see what the U.S. is willing to offer. China right now, it has much a higher priority in the Taiwan situation and other talks involving the U.S.-China relationship. And we saw that reflected in the readouts from the meeting in Rome, where China emphasized these points a lot more than the Ukraine issue, which was featured in a secondary readout.
We'll come to this point. China disputed assertion made by U.S. officials on Tuesday that Russia has requested military aid in Ukraine, accusing the U.S. of spreading malicious lies that could escalate the crisis. The Chinese embassy in London said in a statement to Reuters, I quote, on the Ukraine problem, the U.S. has frequently prompted destructive falsehood about China.
Recently, the United States released a series of fake news targeting China on the Ukraine crisis with malicious intent. China's position on the Ukraine issue has been clear and consistent. We have always played a constructive role in calling for peace and negotiations. The most urgent issue right now is for all parties to exercise restraint, calm the tense situation instead of adding fuel to the fire, and promote a diplomatic resolution instead of escalating the situation.
Coming back to you, Mr. O'Connor, here it is a reply to what U.S. is looking for. China now apparently are being offended by this letter. How U.S. now can manage to bring a common ground with China after this falsehood that has no reliable sources, as Russian officials claimed?
Yeah, so I think the one thing the White House has emphasized throughout this conversation and emphasized to us in conversations yesterday with the press was that they won't be negotiating through the press. So what that means to us is that they are communicating through private channels as well. I think that in any major negotiation, this went with Russia too, of course, if it didn't turn out before the crisis erupted, is that there are back channels that exist. There are going to be public messages put out there, but we don't know exactly how that reflects the reality. So I would imagine the U.S. must be offering something to China. I can't get into the specifics of exactly what that is because I have no verification of it, but there must be some sort of an understanding that this will be in China's interest not to support Russia. Now, whether China, of course, assesses that's the case, I think is an entirely different issue, and I think will speak a lot more to China's geopolitical position. I think in some ways that how China decides to react to this crisis could be perhaps the most important factor in it, perhaps not just in this crisis, but for geopolitics to come for some time.
Mr. Ruslan, how do you explain China's abstention on the decision to condemn Russia in the Security Council? I need an objective answer coming out from an analyst, not a national Ukrainian.
Okay, I'll try to do it. We should understand that China is a main trade partner for Russia and Ukraine among the countries at the same time. And as I understand, China understood that if Russia will be broken in this war, after this war, during this war, that China will be the next, because China has shown competition with the West for the trade, for the markets, global competition. And I don't think that Russia asked the military support from China, because as I know, Russia doesn't need it for nowadays. But of course, Russia needs support from China to come over the sanctions from the Western partners in economy. Moreover, maybe China is trying to use current situation to buy the big parts of Russian energy sector, to take the possibility for the cheaper Russian energy resources, because of the growing up the prices in the world market. China plays her own game, and this country will support Russia politically and economy, but not in military sphere, as I see, because the goal interest of China to win the her own competition with the United States for the global economy.
Ruslan, based on what you have already mentioned, do you think that China could be the solution for Ukraine crisis?
It's one of our proposals from our analytical center. We addressed it to the China government to take more active role in Ukrainian conflict, because China economical, China political interest, and China resources and financial possibilities gives a good platform position to take the very effective role in the resolving of conflict.
Understood. Now coming up to another point, as the Russia-Ukraine conflict enters its third week, US President Joe Biden stated on Monday that the US would back Ukraine by supplying arms, food and money. Biden also stated that while opposing Russian forces, the US would ensure that Ukraine has all the essentials. The US President proposed that the Ukrainian refugees will be welcomed with open arms in the United States. Coming back to you, Mr. Ruslan, do you think that USA has done really what it could before this military operation took place on the 24th of February and even after? Because some critics said that USA is the responsible number one for the crisis. At the end, they left Ukraine alone.
I'll be honest, maybe some brutal, sorry colleagues for it, but United States helps a lot for Ukraine to continue our fighting, but they don't help us to win in this fighting, because a lot of resources we take from the Western countries, the United States especially, financial resources, equipment, but this equipment will not resolve our problem in the air, to close our air, will not resolve our problem with the rocket military equipment. So it's support for continuation this fighting, but it's not enough to resolve to obtain the stable peace for Ukraine. Moreover, United States shows us readiness to fight with Russia, but not fighting for Ukraine. Of course, we are very lucky and very pleasure for this help from the United States. But I think that all global competition between Russia and United States is also a reason of this war. Not alone reason, but it's also a reason of this war. And I think United States should do more on the peace negotiation, not only on the health and sanctions.
Okay, understood. Mr. O'Connor, same thing for the same idea for you. Do you think that USA has done what it could till now?
Yeah, I think the U.S. and its allies and NATO, by and large, have done more than was ever expected to provide the security for a non-NATO country, both in terms of military assistance as well as the economic war they're waging on Russia right now. At the same time, I think that the Biden administration, and I think many other NATO allies would agree, that the priority here was to avoid a direct clash between NATO and Russia, something that the Biden himself has said could lead to World War III. And of course, that's something that's key to being avoided in this situation, especially with the nuclear stakes being so high. And the other thing I would mention is I think we should ask in terms of, is U.S. supporting Ukraine? Are they supporting them diplomatically too? When it comes to these talks, is the U.S. encouraging Ukraine to engage in good faith, and Russia also, in some ways, because we've heard no bilateral contacts between U.S. and Russia since this crisis began. So how is the U.S. sort of leveraging its position diplomatically in this conflict as well? Is part of its discussion with China asking China to take a more assertive diplomatic role? I think China has played a major role, especially telling that after the conversation between President Xi Jinping and President Putin, that President Putin displayed an openness to talks between Ukraine and Russia. So where is the U.S. in this? And I think that's really key, besides just military support, because as my colleague said, military support can only go so far. I think that what NATO has done thus far, even before the conflict, is largely part of the reason Ukraine is still fighting right now and still resilient. So how can we get ourselves out of this, and what are the diplomatic options that the U.S. can provide?
Now to another point. In the United Kingdom, protesters briefly seized a mansion linked to sanctioned Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska in one of the central London's most exclusive addresses. Activists broke into 5 Belgrave Square just after midnight before hanging Ukrainian flags and banners reading, "The property has been liberated." Mr. O'Connor, it is said that Putin's power and more than 30% of his cash sources are the Russian oligarchs all over the world. So, do you think it's really good strategy to put sanctions on them, or it will be only another, rather only make the situation worse?
I think that in the absence of direct military power and direct military confrontation, we've seen the economic war being unleashed. I think that sanctions are a classic asset of the U.S. playbook. In past times, of course, both with Russia and virtually any other country in the world, we've not always seen definitive results of this. Of course, we've never seen it unleashed in such an unprecedented, broad fashion that includes a large coalition as it does right now. I think that what the strategy here essentially is to turn these people against Putin, not only to choke off him economically, but also his political support. We've not yet seen, again, definitive results of that yet. I think there is opposition, of course, within Russia to this war. At the same time, I think that there's a bit of wishful thinking here in the West as to how much it's actually working and how much these people aren't actually blaming the West for now their new economic hardships, if they do face them at all.
Mr. Ruslan, do you think that sanctions only over Russia's economy will bring resolution to Ukraine and stop this military operation? Don't you think that a direct intervention is the only key to survive now?
No, unfortunately, because we should look at North Korea or Iran or many other countries who are all modern history, their history under the sanction, and it will not lead it's not straight way to changing the regime, to changing the politics of this country. Of course, there should be a sanction and there should be negotiation. Moreover, talking about such great country like Russia, we should understand that there is impossible to absolutely isolate this country. There will be countries who will take the sanctions to the Russia, near 50 countries for nowadays. And but in the world there are more than 200 countries. And so sanction is good, but at the same time, I think not all sanctions on the Russia is good, because many of these sanctions may made a bad effect for Putin's opposition. Peoples who are in Russian society and the opposite of Russian politics. Many of these people, I talked with them, many of these people say, we don't support Putin, we don't vote for him, we supported Navalny and others. We are part of the great world, with the Western world. We are happy to have possibility to travel around the world. And why Western countries isolated us with Putin inside the Russian? Because of prohibition of MasterCards, Visa, and many other things. So I think most of sanctions are good, but many of them, these sanctions, we should think over about their effectiveness on the Russian situation.
Mr. Ruslan, based on the statistics has been given, they are saying that the background of the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, he was an actor, comedian actor. He wasn't a politician before. This background led to the escalation of war.
I don't think so, but maybe Russia thought before that Zelensky is weak president, and they have in their mind that Zelensky will be ready to capitulation. It wasn't worked such way, maybe. But nowadays Zelensky has extremely high level of support in Ukraine, near 90% of support inside of Ukraine. Real national leader.
Okay, to another point of our discussion. The Turkish President Recep Erdogan received the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Ankara in his first official visit to Turkey as the Chancellor of Germany. Both leaders pledged to continue diplomatic works for a ceasefire in Ukraine, while emphasizing the importance of the bilateral ties and the NATO partnership.
Kalıcı ateşkesin tesisi konusundaki çabalarımızı
We will continue our relentless efforts for a lasting ceasefire. We have to protect our friendship with Mr. Putin and also with Mr. Zelensky. Despite Russia, we have done to Ukraine what NATO member countries have not done, and we have continued to support it.
üyesi ülkelerin yapmadıklarını biz Rusya'ya rağmen
Jetzt geht es darum, dass, wie gesagt, ein
We will steadfastly continue the efforts for a permanent ceasefire and that there is a possibility of getting out of this war. What is right and important for all of us is to see that the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine are at stake. The violation of Ukraine's right to sovereignty is an extraordinary violation of European law and of peace in Europe.
außerordentliche Verletzung des europäischen Rechts und des Friedens in Europa.
Mr. O'Connor, how do you see the Turkish participation in this round of talks? Erdogan is well known for his wisdom in diplomacy, and he was a key factor with the Gulf crisis resolution a couple years ago. On the other side, the newly elected German Chancellor Scholz is trying his best to show the Germans and whole world that he is the best replacement to Angela Merkel. So, in your opinion, do you think that their efforts will be fruitful for Ukraine's situation and even for their countries?
I think it'll be interesting in a sort of a supporting role in many ways. I think especially the Russian-Turkish relationship is very complex. They often find themselves on opposite side of conflicts, not only because Turkey's a NATO nation, but on actual physical conflicts with both sides supporting opposing sides in Syria, in Libya, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And now we have another conflict where Turkey has supplied Bayraktar drones, which I think have been quite influential in attacking Russian armor on the ground. Now, as to whether Turkey is willing to risk the full extent of its relationship with Russia on this, I don't think so. I think it's also part of a geopolitical game. We know that Turkey wants to buy S-400s, and they have bought them S-400s, and I think that they'll continue to find ways to work with Russia. And as for Germany, I think Germany is an interesting position as well, because Germany had traditionally, I think, tried to pursue a more independent foreign policy track from other NATO allies, especially in Europe. Now I think that's under challenge, with the U.S. and some of its closer partners in the region looking to rein in Germany and bring it on their side, because Germany, of course, is independently a very economically powerful country and also a very influential country. So how Turkey and Germany now can sort of pool their resources and find a coherent path to supporting Ukraine and trying to end the crisis, I think will be interesting to see. But I do emphasize that I think that many of the outcomes and many of the courses for resolution, at least in the short term, will come bilaterally through Ukraine and Russia during those Belarus talks, perhaps with follow-up talks between President Putin and Zelensky, and then, of course, with the U.S., China, and other major powers, I think, playing a mediating role on the sidelines.
Mr. Ruslan, same thing for you. Do you think that Turkey, with the leadership of Erdogan, as well as Germany, the new Chancellor Olaf Scholz, has the solution in their hands?
I think the Turkish policy on Ukraine is an example of selfish international policy, because from the one hand, Turkey sells for Ukraine a lot of military equipment, especially special type of planes and so on. From another hand, Turkey became a new hub, air hub for Russian travels. Turkey buys a lot of Russian weapons. They have good trade negotiation with Russia. Turkey is looking for their national interest in this situation. Germany is also. And as I think, for resolution of Ukrainian conflict, there should be extremely strong guarantees from the many countries, from the nuclear countries, of course, and from the countries maybe of G7 at all, or even G20. Only all general, all world guarantees and participation in resolution of this conflict will lead to his resolution, because many countries have their own interest in the conflict. This conflict has sea level, domestic Ukrainian level, regional level conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and global level conflict between Russia and the Western countries. And in these all three levels, we should to find solution and we should to find agreement.
Mr. O'Connor, coming back to you and coming back to the first point of this military operation, Vladimir Putin, Russian president, said that I'm trying to protect the national security of my country. How do you explain this if USA has made the same thing? I mean, Russia went to Canada or Mexico and done the same thing, create an alliance with Mexico and Canada. How USA will react to this situation?
Sure, yes. Well, I mean, I think that if the Cold War is any indication, the U.S. would react quite negatively and perhaps in an interventionist manner as well. I think the hope was that decades later we'd come past that, but at the core of the Kremlin's concerns, of course, in this is that NATO hasn't come past the Cold War. That's Russia's assessment of this, that it's expanded eastward, and that, of course, with Ukraine potentially being a part of NATO, although there's not any immediate indication that either the U.S. or NATO was ready to bring Ukraine on board, but refusing essentially to refuse them. We have this situation now where Russia feels like it has to act by military force rather than diplomacy. And I think that there have been some other concerns expressed as to nuclear weapons. Of course, we've never seen anything like that actually indicated happening in Ukraine, but we have seen a NATO policy of nuclear sharing for U.S. weapons across other European countries in the region. And so that's another reason that Russia has felt that the U.S. has been the one undermining the international security order with various different kinds of armaments and weapons. So I think that Russia feels like if it can get out of this conflict by making sure that Ukraine is neutral, that can be spun as a victory no matter what the situation on the ground is. And I think that it's important that's emphasized in these talks right now.
Mr. Ruslan, do you think that Russia, defending its national security, has all right to do so, but when they are trying to defend, they make the killings and the destruction in Kiev? Do you think that they lost the right to defend their national security?
Of course, the way of defending national security, we're talking about the intervention of Ukraine, is absolutely illegal, dangerous, and it's only a mistake. It's a geopolitical mistake from Russian side, I think. But I think Russia used this instrument because she exhausted all another instruments, informational, economical, political instruments of influence of Russia on Ukraine, on Europe. We were exhausted this instrument.
Mr. Ruslan, it is said that Ukraine is responsible because Putin has asked them to withdraw their alliance with NATO, with USA, but they always refuse.
We are an independent country, and it's our will how to do which country are our friend or which blocks are applicable for us. But I think talking about the responsibility, of course, the core responsibility leads on Russia. But in this situation, Ukraine, NATO countries, United States, and other participants of peace negotiations
Okay.
between Ukraine and Russia.
Okay, Mr. Ruslan, thank you so much. The lack of time, otherwise we will continue. Mr. Okana, Mr. Ruslan, thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure to have you with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Stay tuned for our news bulletin right after this coverage. Bye-bye.